Hey, what's up everybody? This is Osterberg501 and today I'm going to continue and complete my series looking at all of the different classes for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. And today we're going to be looking at the Stabbomancer. And the class feat is a dirty fighting. The Fate Maker's critical hit chance is increased. Now this is the most boring class feat I think of any of the other classes we've looked at, but even though it's boring, depending on how much crit this actually gives, this is probably going to be one of the strongest ones, because this will most likely just be a massive damage buff to pretty much any build that is focused on doing crits, critical hit damage, critical hit chance, anything like that is probably going to want the Stabbomancer as one of the two classes. And then for our first action skill, we have a Ghost Blade. The Fate Maker throws out a Ghost Blade which spins in place at the target location, dealing melee damage periodically to enemies based on the Fate Maker's equipped melee weapon. Pressing the action skill button while Ghost Blade is active causes it to teleport to the target location and reduces its remaining duration by a small percentage. So this is actually a pretty interesting ability. So first off, I think it's the only ability that scales off of melee damage and is based off of your melee weapon. Now I'm assuming this is going to get other effects from your melee weapon and will probably have a look of your melee weapon maybe, but having a melee build with this as your action skill is probably going to be pretty good. And then you can also move this around by reactivating it, and it just reduces its duration by a little bit, which is also pretty cool. So if you miss a target or if that target dies, you can then place it somewhere else and have it hit another target. So if a boss jumps around, you can then move this. So overall, a pretty cool ability. Then our second action skill is from the shadows. The Fate Maker enters stealth, turning invisible. While in stealth, all damage dealt is automatically a critical hit, but critical hits deal reduced damage. So again, another really interesting ability, because this is the only ability in the game that has stealth, and this could also be a pretty strong ability. And this shares an effect that was in Borderlands 3 as well, where Flak had an ability where he would deal all crits but also deal reduced critical hit damage. But dealing all crits still makes this incredibly strong, and with certain builds this is going to be absolutely ridiculous. Then for our tier 1 of our passive skills, we have Arsenal. 5 points max, melee damage is increased, spell damage is increased, and gun damage is increased. So this is pretty much just a 3-for-1. You pretty much increase all of the damage you're going to be dealing with pretty much everything in the game. Then we have haste, 3 points max, melee attack speed is increased, movement speed is increased. When you cast a spell, double this bonus for the duration. And like I mentioned before, anything that increases your movement speed always makes your build just a little bit more fun. Then we have potent poisons, 5-point max, status effect damage is increased, status effect duration is increased. And this is definitely something that can be really strong, and I definitely am curious to see full status effect damage builds that just have really long durations and do crazy amounts of damage over time. Then for tier 2, we have a follow-up, 3 points max. Whenever the Fate Maker deals gun damage to an enemy, increase the damage of your next melee attack. This effect can stack. Melee attacks consume all stacks. And this is a really cool ability as well. This honestly kind of reminds me of something you would find in an MMO with some of the classes. So essentially just dealing gun damage stacks up a melee damage increase, and then once you melee something you consume all stacks. So I could definitely see builds trying to create a one-shot melee build with this ability depending on how much it stacks. Then we have a Swift Death, 5 points max. While moving, the Fate Maker gains increased damage dealt. The faster the Fate Maker moves, the greater these bonuses. So again, just mixing it with the other passive we just talked about gives us increased movement speed. Now we'll deal more damage the faster we're moving. And I think Zane had something that was exactly like this. So get all those movement speed skills and do a bunch of extra damage. Then we have Exploit Their Weakness, 3 points max. Whenever the Fate Maker applies a status effect to the enemy, the affected enemy takes increased damage from all sources for its duration. This effect can stack per unique status effect. And this could be incredibly strong depending on how many status effects you'll be able to easily apply. And say for Borderlands 3, I even had some builds that allowed you to apply pretty much every status effect in the game very easily. I called it the rainbow builds. And if you could do something like this, that would be incredibly interesting and probably really strong. Then for tier 3, we have Nimble Nimble Fingers 3 points max. Whenever the Fate Maker deals melee damage, their fire rate and spell damage are increased for a duration. So this is just mixing in a bunch of different types of gameplay. So melee damage will keep up your fire rate and spell damage increases. Then we have Shadow Step 1 point max, a kill skill. The Fate Maker's next melee attack is a guaranteed critical hit for a short duration. And I could definitely see this being mixed with the damage stacking melee passive we just went over, to where you stack up all your melee damage, get a kill, and then hit with your next melee attack, guaranteed crit, massive damage, attempted one-shot melee build. And then for tier 4, we have Sneak Attack, 5 points max, critical hit damage is increased, so just a passive damage increase. Then we have Elusive, 1 point max. You can now shoot and sprint at the same time, gain a chance to evade incoming damage while moving. The faster you move, the greater the chance. This is very interesting as well. So now you can shoot and sprint at the same time, already incredibly strong. Then you can just evade any incoming damage, and the faster you move, the greater the chance you have of evading that damage. So now all those speed buffs are going to just make you much tankier. I could definitely see some pretty ridiculous stuff happening if this passive isn't balanced correctly. Then we have a Contagion, 3 points max. Whenever the Fate Maker applies a status effect, there's a chance it spreads to nearby enemies. If there are no enemies nearby, deal a percentage of the status effect's total damage to the enemy instead. Again, another really powerful passive. And I like how this has 2 parts that makes it so it's not just completely useless if there's only one enemy. So if you're in an AoE situation, your status effect can just spread to other enemies. If you're using a status effect build, this will be incredibly strong for AoE. But then, say if you're facing a boss or just one enemy is left, and there's no enemies for it to spread to, and instead deals a piece of that status effect's total dot damage just as an additional hit. And this, stacked with certain effects and a lot of status effect damage, could definitely be chunking bosses. Then for tier 5, we have 1,000 cuts, 5 points max. Critical hits grant the Fate Maker increased damage dealt for a duration. This effect can stack up to 10 times. Melee critical hits grant additional stacks. So this is just any crits gives you increased damage. And then if you're doing crits with melee, it just lets you stack this up quicker. So it's still max of 10 stacks. And depending on how much damage this does, this will be pretty massive for crit builds. Then we have Alchemical Agent, 1 point max. Melee critical hits apply a random status effect. Now, with all the other status effect passives we just went over, if there is any melee weapon that hits really quickly, and I definitely think there possibly could be, maybe one just hits a bunch of times instead of one, maybe one just does a bunch of damage procs off one hit or something, this could be ridiculous with that. And this also depends if this can just reapply a status effect you already have on the enemy, because if this forces a new status effect that isn't on the enemy, this could be pretty ridiculous. Then finally, for tier 6, we have Executioner's Blade, 1 point max. Gun and spell critical hits have a chance to create a ethereal blade above the target that will impale them after a short delay. Ethereal blades deal melee damage based on the Fate Maker's equipped melee weapon. So the Stabbomancer seems like it's going to be required for melee build, and this is really strong. And this is just based off of gun and spell critical hits, can just create this big blade that drops down and just hits enemies based off your melee weapon. And this is the same with the ability we went over. I'm wondering if this is also going to take other special effects from weapons, so status effects or elemental damage or any special legendary effects. It's probably going to work like it's a different version of an actual melee attack. So again, like a lot of the passives for the Stabbomancer, pretty interesting effect. So that's everything I want to go over with the Stabbomancer. And the Stabbomancer definitely has a lot of very strong and interesting effects. And from reading through all this, it seems like the Stabbomancer is going to be the enabler of builds for a lot of different builds in the game, because a bunch of these specific passives seem like they're almost built to just add a major part of a lot of builds. I think the Stabbomancer is going to be an integral part of creating a massive amount of build in the game, because there's just so much unique stuff in here that will be incredibly strong when combined with the right effects and builds. But that's pretty much all I want to go over for the Stabbomancer. So subscribe if you want to see more Wonderlands or other videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about the Stabbomancer, and thanks for watching.